What do you think about race? And what does it have to do with the extended consciousness stuff that I'm always talking about?
Come on. Hey, hang on. Chris, I want to introduce you to some friends. This is David and Marcia Wincott, Ronald and Celia Jeffries, Hiroki Tanaka, and Jessica and Friedrich Walden.
Too many names to remember, but hi.
Do you find being African American has more advantage or disadvantage in the modern world?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Hey. Yo, my man. They were asking me about the African-American experience. Maybe you could take this one. Sorry, man.
Okay. Get out!
Yo!
No!
Yo, chill, man.
Get out!
Chill, man. We're gonna chill.
That's a clip from the 2017 Oscar-nominated movie Get Out. It is a movie that approaches some of these topics of race, genetics, bloodlines in a rather new and novel way. But from my perspective, from the Skeptiko perspective of consciousness and extended consciousness, it just sounds like bullshit. I mean, I'm just going to be really blunt. I'm looking at a picture of you and I'm going, Irishman, man, this guy's pretty brown-skinned. And then I'm reading your background and you say in your bio that your grandfather was this kind of famous Sikh, right?
No, that's right. I am Irish with Norwegian background, and part of my family comes from the northern of India. When you say Sikh, that'll pretty much nail it for people, because within Sikhism, there's several different castes, and the highest caste, the philosopher caste, was called Jat, J-A-T, and my ancestors are coming from the Jat Sikhs. So these are a philosopher caste. This is a caste that is known to be pure Aryan, pure Caucasian. So even though the tone of the skin may be off-white, darker because of the hot climate that my ancestors moved over to India, they are in fact Caucasians. So on both sides of my family, it's Caucasian blood there, partly from Norway, and then the Norwegians came over.
This history, the land, the blood, you feel like that's important to you?
Yes, it's important to me, yeah.
I'm with you on that, and I think you're right to point that out and point all the corruption that often comes with religion, because it's essentially about controlling people. No matter how good the idea is initially, it becomes institutionalized and it becomes this vehicle for control because it's pushing on all the same buttons, right? So your spiritual, quote unquote, whatever that means to you, development opens you up and makes you vulnerable to some very human, cultish, manipulative kind of things. And we see that happening again and again. But let me slow down, because sometimes we get into talking inside baseball and people aren't following. And let me tell you a little bit about my journey with Skeptiko, because when I approached these topics for myself, I was relying on science, as you alluded to. I thought there were problems with the way that this fake dogmatic materialism was being applied, but I liked the method. So one of the first questions I came to was this question of consciousness. And then when you get into consciousness, quickly the fundamental question becomes, what is the nature of consciousness? Is it brain-based or is it not? And you've nailed that over and over again. And I like how you've done it. And my work kind of mirrors and is very compatible with yours. But then, I take this question of the survival of consciousness, which is really the fundamental question for completely blowing apart the scientific materialism, you are a biological robot meme. So you look at that, and the science behind that is, hey, we've started to resuscitate all these people, So the people who first ran across this, and you know this, but I'm recapping it for the benefit of all our listeners. You had heart surgeons, and the guy has a heart attack, and they resuscitate him, and the guy goes in to talk to him the next day, and he goes, hey, doc, I heard what you said while I was under. You said, how does this guy have such a heart like this? And the doctor turns white as a sheep. He goes, How the hell did you know I said that? You were dead when you had no heartbeat. I was there. Your heart was open. He goes, well, I was above and I looked down and I saw what was happening. So you got that as a point, this now 200 peer-reviewed papers of near-death experience. But if you go between lives, you take, Michael Newton is a hypnotherapist, and anyone who doesn't believe in hypnotherapy needs to just do a little bit of research. But he's regressing people so he can find out why they're afraid of spiders or why they are afraid of heights or whatever. He's regressing people, and all of a sudden, this person says, I'm on a battlefield in Ireland or wherever the hell it is, and I'm holding a sword and a shield. He spontaneously brings these people back to prior lives, right? So then he applies that and does a bunch of research on that, and it's good research. You got the guys at University of Virginia, which I alluded to. They're doing real research on reincarnation. And it's, in some ways, it's not that hard to do. You go find all these points of memory that these young kids, 3 and 4 years old, have that it would be impossible for them to know. My whole point in that whole thing, and I appreciate you listening, is that there's all this scientific evidence that suggests that the life that we have is one of many lives that our consciousness occupies during this existence that it has. And I'm kind of being careful with the words because it does get into this very spiritual sounding, dogmatic kind of stuff. But at the very least, consciousness survives after bodily death, and consciousness seems to occupy many different life forms during its existence. Isn't that fundamental to some of these questions that we're talking about in terms of who we really are?
Yes, it is. And see, my whole coming at the same topics that you're talking about is to analyze the credibility of the types who deny everything you're saying.
Now, in this interview I have coming up with Michael Tsarion, we talk about a lot more than race. And I want to say again, I say it many times in the interview, I'm really glad that there are people out there like Michael who are willing to push some of these buttons, and most importantly, are not afraid to get on a show like this and hash out things so that people can get maybe some different perspective on these points. And as you'll hear, there are a lot of things that Michael and I see eye to eye on. Race doesn't happen to be one of them, but hey, that's okay. So the interview is coming up in just one second, but I did want to make a little note before we get started. I realized as I was recording this, I talk about Skeptiko as if there's a Skeptiko perspective somewhere out there in the universe, or that I've defined. And, I've always wanted it to be that way. I've always wanted this show to generate a community of like-minded people who are interested in skeptically analyzing everything in a real, genuinely skeptical way that incorporates in a deeply spiritual perspective as well, because I think ultimately that's where we wind up. So this is a call out to anyone who's thought about getting involved in Skeptiko in a deeper way. I have a number of projects that I'd love to do that I never get around to doing, that I don't have time to doing, and quite frankly, I don't have the talent to do. So if you're out there and you're a good writer or a good YouTube producer or have other talents that might be useful to this endeavor, let me know. I even have a little bit of money to throw at it as well. So if that can help you out, maybe we can do some things together. I've reached out in the past, and it's fun to connect with people who are interested in kind of rolling up their sleeves and kind of making this project part of something on their to-do list. That's all it is for me. It's a passion project, obviously. I don't make any money on this. I just spend money on it because I think it's important. It's important to me, and to whatever extent it contributes to the ongoing dialogue we're all having and generating, and at the same time being a part of, hey, that's great as well. So reach out to me. Let me hear from you if you're interested in joining this community in a deeper way. But now, let's get on to this interview with Michael Tsarion. Today we welcome Michael Tsarion to Skeptiko. Michael is an Irish-born writer, speaker, and a podcaster. He has an excellent podcast called Unslaved that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about many of his books as well, and about this film he's working on. So we can actually add filmmaker to that list. Michael, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Alex. It's lovely to be on. I really enjoyed our conversation on Unslaved. It was one of the most electric we've enjoyed on that show. So again, great. I was looking forward to being on the show to talk with you again, and again to just celebrate your great book. Why Science is Wrong About Almost Everything. I've read it from cover to cover and love every single page in it. It's a marvelous work.
Well, that's super nice of you to say, but as I was just commenting, without getting too much into the love fest, I keep running across your thing and I run across these little nuggets, and then I'm like, wow, that's so cool. And then I'm kind of still a skeptical guy. I'm always, looking over my shoulder and saying, hey, where is this guy going off the rails? What's he going to lay on me here and there? And we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I'm always amazed at some of the similarities, really, that we have in kind of approaching some of this work. So let's start out. Tell people a little bit about, you've written a number of books. We're going to talk about several of them during the show as they pop up. There's this most recent one that's really going to strike a chord, maybe a discord with some folks. Your most recent one, Dragon Mother, maybe we can talk about that. Path of the Fool, we can talk about that. So many things we can talk about, but maybe what we can start with is this film project that you're working on, because it looks like quite an undertaking as well. Do you maybe want to start there and tell folks about this film you're working on?
Sure, why not? It's based on a long series of work that I've done on the Irish origins of civilization. And one of the branches of that, a cadet study, is called the Occult History of Ireland. They go together, but at the same time, they're slightly different. The Irish origins of civilization is a more sweeping look at things we know about the movement of the tribes. How did nations come to be nations? And more important than that, when you see these elements of civilization, be it something as simple as basket weaving or hieroglyphics, all the way up then to the building of these colossus, stone circles, the pyramid. Whenever you see these elements of civilization, be they even in music or calculation or what it might be, geometry, where do they all come from? And there's a body of evidence out there that says that it comes from the West. And if one really delves into that, then unfortunately it becomes paradigm busting. It's not that, that's the reason I chased it. It's just that that's what comes of it. And I'm not the first to deal in that. There were a few wonderful characters, like Ignatius Donnelly, the American, and others who'd been looking into this subject. And then it becomes a whole reversal of what we know about the movement of the races and the movement of the elements of these.
Can I jump in there? Can I jump in there for a minute? I want to deconstruct some of the things you're saying. There's so many points to hit on. And one of the things that I love that you bring to the table is like race. You just mentioned race about 5 times. And I got to say, I was listening to some of your work and I'm like, ooh, I'm cringing every time you say race. Boom, I'm cringing every time you say race. Because there's so many topics right now that are so hot in terms of race and white guilt and Anglo-Saxon pride. And then I heard, at some point, one of these interviews you did, and you're basically saying, well, race, of course, is not bullshit, but it's kind of not the end answer too. And you're saying that it's another way that we've been manipulated into thinking we're separate, we're different, we can kind of feel superior or inferior, which is really the same thing twisted around. And then I love you have this little thing of like, you throw out just this little nugget about Malcolm X and MLK, that, these two famous civil rights race leaders, race changers in the United States. And you go, well, look at those guys. As soon as they really got into the study of race and got through their anger and frustration with all the problems with race, they realized, hey, this is a game, man. We're no different than the quote unquote white guys we oppose, we're both being oppressed and manipulated in different ways. So before we leave the topic of race, do you want to maybe address some of that and what you mean when you say race?
Well, I've always thought that race was important. That's why it ties into my work on the Irish. But remember, some of the other people that you're mentioning in the movement who are talking about race, they're talking absolute nonsense. So I'd never like to be categorized with them. Even though they do talk about race, I haven't seen any who talk about it legitimately. So I would be opposed to them at that point. And then your other point that you just made is indeed, I agree with that. And that is that although the oligarchy and the plutocracy certainly manipulate, they have an agenda, a Marxist agenda to divide the races, to focus on the discommonalities, if I can use that word. And of course, I'm against that as well. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a proper academic, anthropological and archaeological, whatever you want to call it, subject of race. And exactly there is in legitimate circumstances when you study, say, DNA or race memory and these things. There's a legitimate study of those things, and that's what I look at. And it doesn't focus on the differences between races. It actually focuses actually on the commonalities. You're right. As soon as you say the word, it's one of these talismanic words that immediately gets a knee-jerk reaction. But when you deeply get into the question of race, and I mean deeply on the level of, say, a Gerald Massey, one of my great heroes, you actually are starting to look at the commonalities between race. So far from being something that's there to divide, the real story of race, or the Arya, as I would have called the Western race, now you're looking at their kindredness and how instead of being presented as invaders, whether it was in the past or in more recent times, no, the real story of the races is that the Arya from the West were visitors, and they were migrants, and they were welcome brethren to the nations of the East, be they in the guise of the Goths or the Phoenicians or whatever. So you're looking at commonalities as opposed to differences. But of course, we have an oligarchy today, very much motivated by what could loosely be called a sort of a Marxist socialist agenda. And they will bring up the question of race, and they will have their agents out there speaking about race. And they will have these extremist types who are definitely focusing on the differences and the conflicts. And of course, well, we've just got to realize that that's part of the orchestration of chaos, in order to get everybody in a complete tizzy.
Let me push that a little bit further, because it's kind of a hot button issue for me personally. I've never shared this on the show, but I have 4 kids. 3 of them are adopted. Their racial background is completely different than mine. And yet I believe on a deeper spiritual level that there's this connection that was meant to be. I always remember the story of Raymond Moody, the famous near-death experience guy, I guess, who really started the whole movement of studying consciousness beyond death. And he's also the father of an adopted child, and he remembers his son, when the son was very young, 4 years old, talking about a between-life memory where the son said, I saw you and mommy on the beach, and I decided that I was supposed to come join your family. So take that as a little nugget, a little story. Take the work of course, the reincarnation work, Ian Stevenson, now James Tucker at University of Virginia, all this thing about past lives, between lives, and this whole idea of race, to me, just I don't know. It just loses all of its kind of meaning and significance in terms of what it means on an not intergenerational, but a between lives, an extended consciousness kind of perspective, which I know you're very much into. So how tightly are you holding on to the idea of race? Because I think it kind of slips through our fingers if we try and hold it too closely.
Well, as a person who's of the Anglo-Saxon race, Caucasian race or whatever, it has been an interest of mine, like it would be, say, another person's interested in just general history or the history of the First or Second World War or whatever it might be. As I got into my studies about ancient Ireland, did you know that the ancient name of Ireland was Arya land? Ireland is a very poor corruption of the word Aryan land or Arya land. In fact, the word Iran over in the Middle East is also a corruption of that word, and many others are as well. The word oligarchy, O-L-I, is a etymology that pertains to the Druids. So I just followed wherever the road led me, and then out of the fascination, right, of what the Caucasian race or Anglo-Saxon race or say Gothic race, whatever you have to call it, and again collectively they're known as the Arya. I then got fascinated and wanted to bring that back to the world, because I thought that the destruction, as far as I was concerned in literature anyway, the destruction of the Druids, who are the original aristocracy, Aryan aristocracy is aristocracy, or the oligarchy, their destruction, right, by the Romans and other sinister forces back in time there was a footnote. And so it just followed the road wherever it led, and then wanted to speak about my race, as all other races do. In fact, since the turn of the 20th century, we've had books called The African Origins of Civilization, and every single race in the world has tried to, and I think rightly so, raise the torch, raise the flag, for the significance and the meaning of their race. So, but to answer your question, what I really try to do is bring back the questions of race, and I want to do it in a healthy, holistic, non-confrontational way, so that we can also then bring to the table what the Caucasian race has brought to civilization. It's a very, a great deal has been brought. So it's about bringing that question out of the mud that has been thrown in by these oligarchs, and sort of bring it back to the conversation and the narrative, but mostly just, again, out of fascination for myself, to talk about that this race was universal. And if you don't like the word race, if it does create a knee-jerk reaction in people, then you see it's equally good to use the word caste, Alex, because really, if you really get into it, the Arya, right, the Aryan, the word Aryan can be shrunk to Arya. The Arya really is a caste. And when you get into that, then it means that a man from Africa, a man from China, a man from northern India, southern India, wherever you might want to go, can be a member of the Arya caste, regardless of their actual race and nationality. And of course, I make that very clear in the books and films and presentations that I do, just to also, tone down the idea that we're talking in some sort of, because remember, if you talk about the Aryans and you talk about race in the same sentence, you're often thought of, we would automatically think, that I was in favor of some sort of Nazi ideology, and nothing could be further from the truth. I despise the Nazi ideology and know it for the kind of socialist Marxism that it really, really was. And how they co-opted these terms and co-opted these names is one of the most scurrilous things in history, because they demonized then a legitimate study. But I'm trying to bring that study back as one of my interests, and have so many people all over the world have been, sort of illumined by that, and I've had a great response to that. And that's why we thought I'd do it, maybe taking it further and doing the film. It's just one thing I'm involved in, but yeah, there's a potential, if it gets funded correctly, then, we'll move forward on that project. But I've got a great website that people can visit, the Irish Origins of Civilization. And as I said, the sort of a cadet of that is the Occult History of Ireland. Got an article on my website and several presentations on that. And then people can see what I'm talking about and see that it's a very, very legitimate thing that has so many tentacles, so many interesting, things that it goes into involving the ancient past.
Well, I commend you for, diving into it the way you are, and you're bringing a lot to it. It looks like it's extremely well done, well produced, all that stuff, which is key, I think, nowadays to getting the message out. But I want to drill into this a little bit more, because, it's cool to meet someone like I've met you, and to dig into your ideas, and then, but you never really get to know the person, So I'm looking at, I'm just going to be really blunt. I'm looking at a picture of you, and I'm going, Irishman, man, this guy's pretty brown skinned. And then I'm reading your background, and you say in your bio that your grandfather was this kind of famous Sikh, right? And so what is, if you don't mind, what is your ethnic background, and how does that factor into that? 'Cause, I think it's cool if I understand it right, but I'm not sure I totally have it.
No, that's right. I am Irish with Norwegian background. And part of my family comes from the northern of India. When you say Sikh, that'll pretty much nail it for people, because within Sikhism, there's several different castes. And the highest caste, the philosopher caste, was called Jat, J-A-T. And my ancestors are coming from the Jat Sikhs. So these are a philosopher caste. This is a caste that is known to be pure Aryan, pure Caucasian. So even though the tone of the skin may be off-white, darker because of the hot climate that my ancestors moved over to India, they are in fact Caucasians. So on both sides of my family, it's Caucasian blood there, partly from Norway, and then the Norwegians came over. I think they came over in the 13th century to England. You see, and then some branch of that family from Staffordshire, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Staffordshire, they had a coat of arms, and then somebody from that family, we're not sure yet if it was male or female, crossed over in Southern Ireland, probably way down, near Dublin or Cork, and came into Ireland and moved up to the north of Ireland and started a family line there. So, and then one branch of the family, the more Viking, they were displaced and lost their fortunes, lost their lands around the 17th century. And that's common for many, many families. There was tremendous changes there. So when people are doing genealogy and bloodlines, they'll find out that the 17th century was particularly disruptive to many families, even much more noble families and even ordinary families, whatever. But then the Irish, as I said, picks up where some ancestor came over in the 1700s to Ireland, made their way up to the north.
And this is important to you.
Yeah.
This history, the land, the blood, you feel like that's important to you?
Yes, it's important to me, yeah.
In a Michael kind of way, or do you think it's important in general? Because I've had this conversation with a bunch of folks, and the Druid woman, Emma Restel Orr, I think I interviewed a while ago. And, she's in England, and talks about the land and our connection to the land and all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, maybe for you, maybe that's how it's worked itself into your thing. But man, my ancestry, my grandfather came over from Greece when he was 14 years old with a $5 bill sewn into his jacket. I mean, that's his ethnic background. I never had any connection to Greece. I always thought it was crazy. I went to this Greek church in Chicago, and they're speaking Greek, and I didn't speak Greek, and it never had any significance to me. I've never had any interest in going back to Greece. I'm here in Southern California, and I feel more at home than I ever have. And like I said, I'm surrounded by a family that has all this different racial background. I think it's real for me. The connection I have in this family, in this life, is real, not just on the way that I feel, but I believe that the science of extended consciousness has shown me that it's real on a much deeper level, and that this is how I was supposed to form together. I don't have any connection to land. I don't have any connection to blood. Why are we seeing this so differently?
I don't think we are, because remember, by a strange token, some of the scholarship that goes into these racial questions has been done by Americans in America. So there's a strange, remember, America wouldn't be America without the Scots-Irish. I can't even list the number of presidents that actually came from small villages in both Northern Ireland, and Scotland. The Scots-Irish play one of the most major roles in the War of Independence, and as presidents, and as great scholars and mayors and what have you. And then, of course, we know more about the generic idea of the Irish coming and building everything, right? So in a strange way, race does matter, but it's in a little bit more softer way than most people would think. But see, to answer your question is this: it's one of the downsides of the American psyche, in my opinion, that because of the experiment of coming to America and the incredible zeitgeist in that, the incredible meaning in that, right? It did alienate the Irish and the Germanics and a certain amount the Scandinavians, from their roots. And I don't look at that as a good thing, actually. And I think that if we look at today's times, one of the reasons why things are the way they are is because of this the Western people lost their roots, back to Europe and whatever, and Britain, whereas other immigrants coming across have not, in any sense of the word, lost those roots. So there's a whole conversation to be had there. But you're quite right that the oligarchs that I consider evil, the world rulers, have made it so intolerable for Irish, for Greeks, for Italians to live in their own countries. That's a crime. That is a crime. I don't care if it was a crime in prehistoric times or it was a crime 50 years ago or 100 years ago or in the 1700s. The very fact that the oligarchs of the world made it so intolerable for decent people to live off the land, for them to make a living for their families in their own home territories is a crime. Those people didn't get on boats and leave the most precious things that they ever had to come to America because they wanted to. 99% of them came out because they bloody well had to.
Well, I'm with you on some of that. I kind of think we got to pull up a little bit. I mean, if we circle back to two of the ideas that you mentioned before, one is the caste thing, which I think, if we can, I'd prefer that much more than the race thing. I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense in terms of how people form community, form this sense of identity, and then it carries with it a whole bunch of positive and potentially negative and highly manipulative factors too.
Yeah, but let me interject and say this. If you talked about somebody, say we were having a conversation about Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, nobody would balk twice or have any tender spot, no rational person, about those conversations. How come it is that when you talk about Caucasian race or Semitic race or any whatever, suddenly there's all this tender, and you have to walk on eggshells? You see how it's like, I don't care about that. I'm not politically correct, and I don't care about the soft underbelly of people.
Michael, I would challenge what you just said, which is in a really cool way, because I think you and I would balk at that conversation. I balk at that conversation all the time. When people want to tell me about their Christian worldview, I say, well, that's bullshit. If you spend 3 or 4 hours, or if you read one of your books, you quickly are confronted with the historical problems of being a quote unquote Christian, in the sense of empty tomb and historical Jesus and Jesus of the Bible and all that stuff. It gets exploded in your mind, but no one wants to go there. So everyone kind of keeps quiet and obeys this kind of crazy idea that don't challenge people's religious beliefs. I think we challenge people's religious beliefs all the time. I think it's a good and healthy thing.
Well, it's a good and healthy thing then to bring up the question of race and do likewise. And if people find it, too tender a spot, that's their affair.
I agree with that. So then let me hone in our kind of point of difference, because I haven't heard, and I really don't know what your opinion is on this. So it'll be interesting. This is fascinating because I like and respect your work a lot. So whatever comes of it is great and fine. We don't have to agree. And I think you're of the same mind. What about reincarnation? Like I said, do you believe in reincarnation as a reality of, consciousness doesn't end when we die? It somehow goes on. Maybe it's this whole idea of reincarnation might not be linear in the way we think it is, in terms of one life after another. Maybe they're simultaneous. There's all sorts of ideas out there. But in general, what do you make of that extended consciousness after death and before death?
For me, it's a constant ebb and flow, and it's a constant back and forth with that. I believe that under all of the priest lip, because mostly our theories of karma and reincarnation are just concoctions of priests, be it in the East or be it their version in the West. But I do believe that if you scrape off all of that nonsense, right, and that's based in a lot of lies and based in a lot of placation of the ego, and it's based in a lot of sort of false metaphysics. But but I'll meet you halfway, that if you scrape a lot of that superficial, marzipan off and get right down to the true metaphysics, then I'm more able to see that it's more likely to believe in an afterlife than it is not to, right? Because that brings us to the whole the whole mind-brain interface. When we forget about the religious intonations and start talking in just pure scientific terms, I think the science is in now that actually speaks of, what you're calling reincarnation. I would prefer to call it transmigration, in some sense that it doesn't mean that you just reincarnate in the way that's presented in the East, based on things like karma and whatever. That's, to me, the concoctions of post-Vedic priest-archies, which are some of the foulest creatures that ever walked the earth. But the thing is that behind all of that is a pre-Vedic Gnostic teaching, right? If you can use that troublesome word. And again, when I use it, I don't even mean Gnosticism as we think of it today. Gnosticism, when I speak of it, I mean just the core of something, the core wisdom that is still contained within a teaching, in that sense. It's probably not even a really good word to use. But again, getting back to what I was saying, the pre-Vedic philosophy definitely understands that there is no death, Alex, that when observing a plant or observing the seasonal cycle, observing the life form of any animal, and even the light, the coming and going of light, the pre-Vedic consciousness didn't see that there's anything as death in that sense, and that death is only the gateway to new life. So at this point then, and as I said, if we scroll forward to today, then we have some very interesting science now that shows that obviously, to cut a long story short here, that the organism that we call the universe is a totality and it never perishes. It didn't have a beginning. The Big Bang is one of the foulest, and yeah, I love your work for showing the chicanery that is involved in science. I mean, I'm a believer in science, and I know you're a believer in science. We need science, but we don't need science in the hand of a bunch of ideologists where they're hanging up this scaffolding on something that's rotten behind it. But that just because we critique science, you and I, it doesn't mean by any means that we're debunking the necessity of science. It's just that the scientism behind it is foul. But as I said, coming back to the point, there's a timelessness and a living organicness about the cosmos and all the beings in it, of which we are a key part. So in some mysterious way, I would definitely concur, and I lean on the side that there is what we call colloquially a life after death. But again, has to be removed from any sort of religious trapping, which I think sort of parasited on these ideas.
I'm with you on that, and I think you're right to point that out and point all the corruption that often comes with religion, because it's essentially about controlling people. No matter how good the idea is initially, it becomes institutionalized and it becomes this vehicle for control because it's pushing on all the same buttons, right? So your spiritual, quote unquote, whatever that means to you, development opens you up and makes you vulnerable to some very human, cultish, manipulative kind of things. And we see that happening again and again. But let me slow down, because sometimes we get into talking inside baseball and people aren't following. And let me tell you a little bit about my journey with Skeptiko, because when I approached these topics for myself, I was relying on science, as you alluded to. I thought there were problems with the way that this fake dogmatic materialism was being applied, but I liked the method. So one of the first questions I came to was this question of consciousness. And then when you get into consciousness, quickly the fundamental question becomes, what is the nature of consciousness? Is it brain-based or is it not? And you've nailed that over and over again, and I like how you've done it. And my work kind of mirrors and is very compatible with yours. But then, I take this question of the survival of consciousness, which is really the fundamental question for completely blowing apart the scientific materialism, you are a biological robot mean. So you look at that, and the science behind that is, hey, we've started to resuscitate all these people, So the people who first ran across this, and you know this, but I'm recapping it for the benefit of all our listeners. You had heart surgeons, and the guy has a heart attack, and they resuscitate him, and the guy goes in to talk to him the next day, and he goes, hey, doc, I heard what you said while I was under. You said, how does this guy have such a heart like this? And the doctor turns white as a sheep. He goes, how the hell did you know I said that? You were dead when you knew you had no heartbeat. I was there. Your heart was open. He goes, well, I was above and I looked down and I saw what was happening. So you got that as a point, this now 200 peer-reviewed papers of near-death experience. But if you go between lives, you take, Michael Newton is a hypnotherapist, and anyone who doesn't believe in hypnotherapy needs to just do a little bit of research. But he's regressing people so we can find out why they're afraid of spiders or why they are afraid of heights or whatever. He's regressing people, and all of a sudden, this person says, I'm on a battlefield in Ireland or wherever the hell it is, and I'm holding a sword and a shield. He spontaneously brings these people back to prior lives, right? So then he applies that and does a bunch of research on that, and it's good research. You got the guys at University of Virginia, which I alluded to. They're doing real research on reincarnation. And it's, in some ways, it's not that hard to do. You go find all these points of memory that these young kids, 3 and 4 years old, have that it would be impossible for them to know. My whole point in that whole thing, and I appreciate you listening, is that there's all this scientific evidence that suggests that the life that we have is one of many lives that our consciousness occupies during this existence that it has. And I'm kind of being careful with the words because it does get into this very spiritual sounding, dogmatic kind of stuff. But at the very least, consciousness survives after bodily death, and consciousness seems to occupy many different life forms during its existence. isn't that fundamental to some of these questions that we're talking about in terms of who we really are?
Yes, it is. And see, my whole coming at the same topics that you're talking about is to analyze the credibility of the types who deny everything you're saying.
Right, right.
That's my form of experimentation. I know it's a bit, weird, and skewed, but I say, okay, let us gang together all the people who, knee-jerk reaction, the materialists, the atheists who deny these kinds of concepts. I'm not saying I believe in the concept, but let's see all the deniers come to the table. And then, like yourself, I go through and find out where is their credibility. What do they know about other things? What is the real strength of these arguments? And there's nothing there. It's a big, fat, rotten zero. So then by default, obviously, a rational person says, well then, since these people's commentary on this wonderful subject matter that we're talking about is as worthless as a bunch of rotten banana skins.
And now in particular, you're talking about the materialist, the scientist, the atheist, the postmodernists, right?
Yeah.
Is there anyone else we want to lump in that category?
Even some people who are on the religious side, because their belief in religion is so tawdry, so empty, and so psychologically base that you might as well lump them in with the ones who'd say there's no such thing as spirit. If your belief in spirit is so haywired, anxiety-ridden, and poorly thought out, in other words, matters of faith as opposed to matters of knowledge, then they're not exactly as bad as the first group we talked about, but you might as well lump them in because they just muddy the waters as you try to express in truly philosophical terms and logical terms the existence of the spirit. These guys are going to get up with their own bullshit and muddy the water so much that actually the atheist has a sort of a half insider smile on his face going, when you guys finish, then you'll deal with us. So I want those religious nutballs to be silent so that we can then take on the more spurious people who are changing history with their materialistic philosophy and who permeate most of the institutions of our world. We've got to handle their bull crap, in very rational but very forceful terms and deconstruct and dismantle materialism. And it can be done relatively easily. It's one of the things I specialize in, or at least I specialize in the philosophies that do it, and then try to sort of, like you said earlier, bring it in a layman's terms to people so that, the problem isn't so hard for, people who are busy and have a life and inwardly know what we're talking about now, but would love to have the proof. That's why I champion your book. Your book is one of the things they need it on their shelves as one of the key books of the modern age that actually do exactly what we're talking about, which is bring the war to the enemy, seek them out, and don't get caught up in these little tangential, conversations. They can wait. They can absolutely wait. But then to top off, my comment on your question there is really that in the end, it has to be nothing to do with faith. It has to be knowledge. So in my concept of spirit, it's about personal knowledge. It's not about belief at all. So if somebody was to ask me, do I believe in God? I would immediately have to say no, because I know what you're talking about. You're talking about some theological construct, and you're probably talking about faith. I have to say no then, because it doesn't qualify on both those accounts. Knowledge of the spirit in your life, tangible, intimate knowledge of it, right, is a completely different understanding, obviously, and so in that regard, I would split hairs there. But in general, it needs to be taken to the materialist atheists because their theories are bankrupt, and we need to prove that.
There's a couple of ways that I could take this, and I will. I'm just trying to figure out which order to do it in. But you have this one phrase that you've coined that I think is so wonderful and so unique, and I want to explore it for a minute because it really resonated with me. And you say conspiracy work is spiritual work. And this is something that I've come to rather slowly. I can still remember quite clearly, probably only 5 or 6 years ago, really getting interested in conspiracies, and more than interested. I was sucked in like we all get when we realize that truth and we go, oh my God, could this possibly be true? And I remember the first thing I dove into was JFK. And I kind of got into it and I wrapped my arms around it and I said, oh my God, this was a coup. It was a coup d'etat. But I remember sitting there with my wife on the side of the bed and saying, I got to admit, it really is as bad as everyone said. It really was a coup. I said, but that 9/11 stuff, I would never go that far. And I always think back about that moment because invariably every conspiracy that I've looked at since then has been played out the same way. Oh my God, that couldn't possibly be true. And then the more you dig into it, the more you kind of have to deal with that grinding in the pit of your stomach when you realize that the world isn't what you had hoped it was. But the real payoff at the end is your phrase, is that eye-opening, that conspiracy work is essentially an element of anyone's spiritual work. Because if you're not willing to do that work, well, you fill it in. What about the people who say, hey, I don't need to look at all that stuff. I'm just a happy, new age, life is wonderful, spirit is good kind of person. Talk to that, because you have some interesting things on it.
Well, most of the world is exactly as you describe it. Those are the kind of people. So what has happened? Conspiracies come looking for them. This is why it's spiritual work, because we are here to uncover truth. And that is a different kind of process than most people come into the world thinking. And most people, by the time they've reached their 20s and 30s, have a false idea of what it means to learn something and to come to truth about something and to come to knowledge as opposed to faith and belief. The seeking of real knowledge is deconstructive. Once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. It's a deconstructive, apophatic enterprise, and also paradigm, right? And because there is so much deception in our world, and only a complete idiot would deny that that's the case. Look at the medical profession. Look at all the abuses of scientism and all the rest of it. So we are surrounded by deception. And then we have the phenomena of self-deception within. So given that that is the case, the coming to truth, the coming to any kind of Archimedean point, which you can say, this is what I am, this is what I believe, and to do it on rational grounds, is a very complicated apophatic process that is not taught in our educational institutions. So
it's worse than non-taught, right? You were taught that this is something that you don't want to engage in, right?
Oh, yeah, you are. If you try to do as we're talking about, you will be penalized and you'll be given the D's as opposed to the A's. They want you conformist. They want you deeply conformist. Now, there's a lot of elements to this. There's both positive and negative sides. What we're talking about basically is the heightening of critical skills and judgmental skills. And our society certainly doesn't want that. They want you to know a lot of, they want you to believe a lot of things and have faith in a lot of things, but they don't really want you knowing, like going up to the canvas and smelling the paint. They don't want you doing that. They don't want you gaining a true perspective on life. So why it becomes holy work is just, one definition anyway, for this conversation's purposes, is that you've got to do it yourself. You have to when you realize that none of the institutions out there are going to help you, right, then it becomes something where the circle is shrunk now to your own, dimensions, where you're going to have to pick up the slack. You're going to have to spend the money on the books. It's a frightfully difficult experience. It's costly. You can feel very alienated from the world that you grew up in and from people around you who don't understand the process you're on or why you even want to do it. So this is where it then becomes holy work. But in the bigger sense, why it's holy work is simply because you cannot. It ceases to be just a mere intellectual process in which some intellectual person who has a great brain, let's say, and there are so many of those in our world, Nobel laureates and Menses and all, but you and I would talk to them and we'd make them into infants in seconds because they simply have not worked with this apophatic type of learning. So the man then who has done this, I believe, is a special category person who is in my mind a sage. I did a podcast recently called The Sage and the Psychopath. And to me, the sage is defined by that ability that regardless of what the institutions did or didn't do, he stood outside the city walls like the Buddha. He went down, he sat under a tree, and he went, let's start from the beginning. Let's start from the ABCs. And then he built up personalistic understanding of the way things are through a critical process that, as I said, is apophatic, is deconstructive. That's basically why I call it holy work. I can't see how it's not.
At one point you mentioned Siddhartha Road in one of your talks. And I don't know, but I gravitated on that because I love that work. And I think that work is so multifaceted beyond, especially its origins. But is that partially what you mean here?
Yeah, utterly. And of course, I emphasize that it's partly mythical. Once you start going on the journey, you'll have certain synchronicities because others have walked the path before you. There's no doubt about that. But there's a part that comes on the forest journey when you're climbing up the mountain, where some people can't breathe if they go any further up the mountain, and some others can. So at some point it will become deeply personalistic, and that is one of my great fascinations. My book, Disciples of the Mysterium, makes a case for that. The subtitle is, Inquiry into Selfhood, and it's about that final steps of the journey where you really will have to walk unaccompanied. And that's a whole, not too many people have written about that. But the rest of the journey is, in the Joseph Campbell sense, or the Jungian sense, mythical, because you're not the only chump that's walked the path of enlightenment. Right. Others have gone before you. And, there's going to be certain signposts along the way. And by the way, one of your jobs, if you meet a block on the Great Road, the Pilgrim's Progress, is to not only ask what banana left it here for me to encounter it, and now that I've encountered it, should I not remove it for those who've come behind me? So there's a duty. The holy work is also very much about a duty that you have, a responsibility that you have to wave a finger at the gods who went ahead of you and go, oi, 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 hey, you left this here. What's your game? I find fault in that.
Yes.
And at the same time, then have a duty to those who've come behind you, poor suckers, and say, I'm going to remove this so my brothers have an easier road to climb on and they're not scarred and battered and beaten, like I am. So there's a tremendous responsibility that also makes it a holy work,
Yes. Let me circle back to this Siddhartha Road that you mentioned. Of course, the Hermann Hesse. I'm not sure I heard both ways, but a wonderful book. Which part of that journey are you thinking of? I mean, the wonderful thing about that book is he is all those different things. He is the sage in the forest who can sit around the campfire and beat down the intellectuals of the day at their own game. But he can also walk through the forest by himself. But he can also then eventually sit by the side of the river and be a man who's lived a human life and has had a lover and had a child and had that child do all the things that children do, and yet he's come to an age where he can accept that, his life is what it is. I mean, it's a wonderful story. Which part of that story are you drawn to? Do you relate to as part of your spiritual work where you're at?
Well, I'd say the early parts, because in Hermann Hesse, his book Demian, I certainly highly recommend Steppenwolf and the Siddhartha that you're talking about. For me, you see, it's about the existential journey, or the holy work, begins when you realize that although you do have political forces and educational forces, right, colluding to keep you in serfdom, and that means economic, that means intellectual, and all the rest of it, or at least they'll give you some. If you jump through enough of their hoops, they'll still give you some awards for being, some bright boy or whatever. But this is lunacy, right? This is just institutionalization. And it's also a form of demagoguery. Hey, instead of having one stripe, we'll give you 3. It's just demagoguery, right? And then all your needs are met, right? No. So the early existentialists are saying, I understand that these institutions exist that hold me down and smother my spirit. But there's another institution that exists that does the same and probably even worse. And that's called the masses. That's the collective. The collective is a form of tyranny. And this comes out of the teachings of, so when you read it in Hesse and men like that, they're picking it up from people like Kierkegaard and people like Nietzsche, and there's a lot of good philosophy in them as well as some horrible stuff as well. But some of the good stuff in there is this existential idea that I have to separate myself and differentiate myself from the masses, starting with my family, starting with the peers, starting with the priests and teachers and politicians and the rest of mankind who think in terms of consensus. I've got to decompress from that. I've got to go cold turkey. And that can mean different things for different people. Some people do have to actually go to a forest or go to mountains or go to be quiet, and others don't. They can do it right in the middle of Adelaide. They can do it right in the middle of Los Angeles. They can do it right in the middle of their family because it's a mental process. There's no actual need to again, it's all based in individual subjective treatment of this, right? But that was the thing that fascinated me, rather than following all of these guys along, because then they're really handing you another manual. I didn't like that. I just like the fact that the early pointers are good, and then they send you out on your own road, to make in a personalistic sense. So this just the idea that the masses and their hive think, can be as much an iron cage of conformity as anything else that the bona fide organizations that we sign on. So white magic ritual, we sign on for it. We cross the dot. We sign on the dotted line. We walk across their thresholds. So it's more complex than, of course, we can get into now. But
we're co-conspirators,
as you like to say. Yeah, we are. Yes. The secret of my work is really that And that's why it's quite unpopular, in that I keep on bringing back the emphasis to how the slave is complicit in his own enslavement. You don't want to get into that if you want to be popular. I don't want to be popular, so I don't care, so that's why I get into it. But it's certainly not popular.
As maybe a final topic, and there's a lot to pull apart in what I'm going to throw on the table, but I think it maybe drives home in a concrete level what you're talking about. I sent you a YouTube of the very excellent Jordan Peterson, who is a champion these days of kind of getting in the face of this kind of crazy postmodernism that we see on college campuses and in the social justice warrior and stuff like that. And people, again, have a knee-jerk reaction to go, oh, he's some white guy, or he's alt-right, or it's like, man, I am so far from being alt-right. It's crazy. That doesn't even make any sense to me. Right, left, partisan, Republican, Democrat. That's just those ideas. I just have to laugh when people say that. But that's what people are conditioned to believe. But here's the point that I think touches on your work. You have somebody like Jordan Peterson, and folks who don't know Jordan Peterson, I don't know if we can kind of bring him up to date, but I mean, he's this professor at University of Toronto, which is this bastion of this kind of crazy, out of control, postmodern liberalism that, doesn't make any sense and wants to arrest people if they use the wrong gender pronoun and all the rest of this stuff. And he's really been effective at kind of countering that. So in a minute, we're going to talk about postmodernism and how ridiculous it is. And yet at the same time, it does relate in a way to a certain stepping outside of the boundaries of conformity and understanding the relativistic nature of things at a truth level that has been totally obscured because the whole project of postmodernism has been hijacked and turned into this whole way of controlling people another way. But I digress yet again. That's why I say it's hard to pull this apart. The YouTube video I sent you is of Jordan Peterson, who is now this champion for folks like you and I who say, God, he's just saying the obvious, and I'm so glad it's resonating with people. But he's asked point blank, are you a Christian? And I thought his answer was so telling, because here's a guy who is super intelligent in the way that you're talking about, is a champion of all these ideas, is articulate, is able to combat some of these forces. And yet he hasn't done an hour's worth of research into this religious system that he holds so dear. And he stumbles around with, well, yes, I'd have to say yes. And then the guy says, well, what about the empty tomb thing? And what about the historical? And he's like, well, I don't know. All he has to do is go read the first page of your book, and all that silliness would be left aside. So there's a bunch of questions that we can pull apart there, but how does this happen?
Well, he's mainstream. You give him 3 stars, but no more than that, because a person like me who's been into the depth of this alternative movement and the conspiracy movement for over 20 years now looks with favor on a guy like that. But he's not that articulate on certain areas, even of the subjects that he handles. Sometimes he's really good, and it's nice and fresh, and there's fresh new punches, from a man within the system like that. I always give stars to people from within the system because it's needed. We had Dr. Bruce Lipton on our Unslaved podcast recently. Same thing, 5 stars there for the work that he's bringing to bear. And Jordan Peterson, for me, gets 2 to 3 stars because he does deal with some stuff that is very, very important, and he lends new perspectives to that. And as I said, he gets another star because he's from the inside, and it's so needed. We so need people from the inside to be shaking up the rotten system. But at the same time, I've watched numerous of his programs in which his analysis or his comments on an area of philosophy, I can't remember off the top of my head right now specifics, but it's been poor. It hasn't been up to scratch. And also we've invited him on the podcast, our podcast, several times, and he flat turns us down and won't come on. And then some of the reasons he gave us are completely spurious, because 2 weeks later we find him on a dozen other little knick-knack radio shows out there that are not as prestigious or not as in depth as ours is, or as long term. So there's something there as well that's very peculiar. And of course it doesn't just go for him. We've invited several people on who just turn us down flat, saying they've got no time, they're writing a book, they'll talk to us later, and then 2 weeks later or even less, you see them on a host of other little far less confrontational radio shows. I don't know. It's just a question mark there. But
but that is. Let me jump in there and say, it is amazing how people do not will avoid at every turn any kind of even chance for disagreement of any type. Like I just said, we were able, when I was on Unslaved, we did not agree on everything.
And you jumped to coming on, didn't you? You jumped when we called you and you said, yeah, I'm coming on. We love that. Why not? Why can't they all do that?
Absolutely. And same with you, So we go through on Unslaved, I was on there and we did an hour and a half or whatever. And we have this, just really good talk, about a bunch of different stuff, but we don't agree about a lot of stuff. No. And I say, hey, Michael, why don't you come on Skeptiko? And you're like, sure. So you're not there worried that I'm going to hit you with some secret thing. You're like wide open.
Oh, yeah.
I don't understand how people cannot be that way. I'm like people who ask for questions in advance. Hell, I'll send you all the questions in advance. That's not the problem. The problem is, even if I dish them up to you in advance, you still can't handle answering them because you just don't want your beliefs challenged is what it really amounts to. No one wants.
What do you call the guy when you walk into a fancy restaurant and you have to, is it the host or somebody who greets you first, the greeter?
The maitre d'.
Right.
Yeah.
He's a good maitre d' because there's great people beyond him. Colin Wilson, G. Edward Griffin. He's a good maitre d' for the one who's just come in to lick the window. And believe me, he gets stars for that. But my God, there's geniuses.
The thing I wanted to highlight, because I think it gets to, if people find you to be too conspiratorial, which a lot of people will, what I wanted to point out here is a real life example of exactly what you're talking about. Because Jordan Peterson is a good guy and he's a smart guy. Why the hell hasn't he looked at his own religion? Why when that guy pushed him, and he didn't even push him, the guy just tosses out a question and says, well, are you a Christian? And he stumbles and then has to say, well, I guess I'd have to say yes. And then he just says, well, I don't know what to do with that because I can't believe you're really a Christian. Do you believe in, the empty tomb? And he goes through the rest of the stuff. How do you not have an answer for that? This is to your point precisely. How can you go through life, devote your life to an identity of being in this faith group and everything that goes with that, in this cultural identity, this caste, and it's a club and it's a caste, and not do the work so if you throw at him what you throw at him about Christianity, or if I throw at him about its Roman roots or whatever, why don't they have a spirited debate already resolved in their mind in order for them to continue to pursue that religion? But they don't. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to come on your show and debate it. Why wouldn't they? It just is pure proof of a solid proof of what you're saying, I think.
Oh, yeah. And we've had even atheists, top people, I won't mention any names, but some of the most senior people on YouTube who are into atheism, and we've begged them to come on time and time again so that we can have that conversation. And again, they won't do it. Oh, yeah. So as I said, I remember we talked about this a few minutes ago. The weakness is on their side. The bankruptcy is completely on their side. So when they do that, to me, it's just further proof that they're not standing in honor and standing in integrity.
Well, and I think they're at a very deep psychological level. They're afraid. And we've all been there. I mean, beliefs are tricky. And I think particularly with the Christians and the atheists both, I think what's going on, and you just talked about a Jungian kind of approach to it, so I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I think people are actually processing this information more completely than they let on. So they're processing the absolute absurdity of the Christian proposition as it's normally kind of delivered. And they're processing it, and then they're going through, how could I really live that truth? And then they're realizing, I can't really live that truth, so I better just go this way. And I think the atheist is essentially doing the same thing. They're processing the absurdity of their position, that their life is meaningless. And they go, well, I don't really believe my life is meaningless.
Fantastic. Yeah, great point. Yeah, I can add to that one thing, and that is that they refuse to sensitize themselves. It's a matter of sensitivity. And remember, the only person who can sensitize the insensitive is the one himself. So any kind of badgering from the outside or laying your heart out and laying the facts out to an insensitive person, everyone listening to us knows it doesn't work. They themselves have to go through some sort of epiphanic experience where then they change from within.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Michael, this has been a fantastic hour, just kind of ripping through stuff and in this kind of way that we should do more often. I'd love to have you on more and connect with you, particularly about as things happen, because I think you would bring a unique perspective to it. But we've only touched so briefly on your current work and stuff that's going on with you. What else should we tell people about things that are going on? You mentioned the Unslaved podcast. I highly recommend it. You have just a great dialogue. David and you are a good team. You really bring some issues and add to each other. What are some of the shows you have coming up, and what are some of the shows you've done recently? And then also tell us about some of these books that are new and that you might be working on.
Yeah, there's the Dragon Mother came out a couple of months ago. We haven't done a podcast on that yet because we've got so much on the calendar. But you're right, we have lots of stuff coming up. A lot of my work, for people to understand it, because you mentioned it being conspiratorial and all, even more than that is my motive for doing anything, for putting pen to paper, for doing the podcast, is to honor the great minds of the past. I very much believe that the past is the repository of truth. So whenever we meet a problem in today's world, and I don't care if it's economic or social or whatever it might be, right? We need to look back into the archive of the past because our ancestors did things the right way the first time around. So my work is distinguished by being homages really to various people, like Dragon Mother was written, not just to express the ideas that are in Dragon Mother, but as an homage to people like...
Quickly tell folks about Dragon Mother, because it's quite provocative, particularly in this time that we're in with the rise of the reemergence of the neo-feminism kind of craziness and some of the other stuff that's going on.
Well, I'd like that book to not even be identified with any of that. Of course, you're always identified with the milieu that you happen to be in, of course. Right. But this is a vaster study. It comes under the heading of psychology, obviously. A lot of philosophy is involved in it. But it's basically, as I said, an homage to a couple of the dedications are in the first part of the book, so people can read them there. But the two that I could certainly mention that have inspired the work were Immanuel Velikovsky, who I consider a great hero of mine, and also Erich Neumann, the Jungian. So Erich Neumann, you see, wrote a book, right, that didn't get published when he was alive, Alex. He wrote a book on child psychology that wasn't ever published in his lifetime. And then finally, when the Jungians got around to publishing it, they published it in a sort of a mishmash, of just his essays. It wasn't put together particularly well. And so if you read it, people can be very, very, very confused. It seems very haphazard. There is a structure within it, but he died. The man passed away, and they didn't do justice to his book. So the Dragon Mother was to pick up the story of the fetus, and here's the answer to your question, not as the fetus becomes, or the infant becomes conscious at the Oedipal stage, which can happen about 2.5, 3 years old and goes up to the latency period, about 6 and 7. This has been thousands and thousands of books have been written about that. Whole institutions of psychology exist, based on that sort of quasi-Freudian model, right? But Erich Neumann was this Jungian who, fully cognizant of the Jungian and the Freudian systems, right, took it back into the womb, took the influence of the parents, especially the mother, into the womb. So that's where the book then picks up, because I wanted to do justice to his ideas in that book. I wanted to make them much more user-friendly and understandable. I thought it was a tragedy that the book was not organized correctly and had basically fallen off the map. Even a lot of Jungians don't know about that book, you see. And then to bring to bear other ideas from, say, Otto Rank and Melanie Klein. As I said, all my work, the Irish origins work, the architects of control, you'll all see that they're dedicated to this and that person, be it Jung, be it Newman, be it Velikovsky, be it Melanie Klein or Alice Miller, or even Commons Beaumont, if you go back into the Irish origins work. So all my work is motivated by that. And then that itself then, right, is predicated on the idea that, please, people, never fear, never be pessimistic about your life and your future, because your ancestors have already done things the right way. So if you really have a love of history, they say that philosophy is love of wisdom. Yes, but you can also have a love of history. I don't know what the word would be, filio history or whatever. History should be loved because it's an Aladdin's cave of ideas that we should recycle, update, spring clean, and bring to bear to the problems that we face today, because there's not a problem that we face today. I know people don't think this. The pessimistic kind of mind thinks it's overwhelming. What can we do? But my message to them is very simple. You do as was done by Pericles. You do as was done by Otto von Bismarck. You do as it was done by, Carl Jung or whoever, the Otto Rank, Gerald Massey, some of the names that I mentioned, Immanuel Velikovsky. There's treasures within treasures that are multifarious and can be applied to every situation, both domestically, personally, and even socially, in the archive of the past. And so to cut yourself off and alienate yourself and be so estranged, following the headlines and being into the media and going, oh my God, this is overwhelming, and to forget the names of the people that came before us, the mighty minds, men and women who came before us, who've already worked these problems out, and given it to us. And the list is endless of these people. So I try to pick the ones that I like the best. And then most of my books are written around an homage of a kind. So that's one way to understand all my different work. It's an homage to somebody. I gather laurel leaves for these great people and make sure that their graves are tended. And that's basically my motive.
And the wonderful thing about that, Michael, that I just know you appreciate, but the process of revisiting and reintroducing those ideas updates them by the very process. So it's not like you're looking backwards, because I haven't read all your books, but I've sampled them, and they are very contemporary. They are very relevant to what's going on, because in the process of looking, you are a modern thinker and a very well schooled in modern thought thinker. So the mere process of you looking back and doing that homage is not only reminding us of what's been done, but bringing it to relevancy in our current time. And that's what I felt like when I did dip into the latest book and the work. And I understand it isn't directly about feminism or the men's movement or, the craziness that is ensued there, or in gender issues and all that. But at the same time, it's so tuned into what's going on that no one can read it and not have an immediate sense that this is relevant to our times.
I will say, though, that in one sense, because it is about women and their psychology, yes, it could be seen as a non-consciously, it will probably there is, because the focus has been so much on the malignancy of the male, let's put it that way, and books have been written, and it's a legitimate subject, that women are concerned about. But that seems to have moved now top heavy. So maybe in a non-conscious way, there was an element of, say, hey, wait a minute. I'm not, because personally I'm not into victimhood. I know you're not either. So any cult, whether it's on the male side or the female side, that espouses victimhood, and by God, are we knee deep in that today? Then I'm your enemy straight up. So on a non-conscious level, it was more like, hey, girls, let's focus back on your psychology. And since none of you seem to be interested in doing it, especially in the way that Newman was framing it, then I thought this is necessary, because the female psyche has been left out of the equation now, when all the focus is really on the male peccadillos and the male faux pas and the male way of life and the paradigms of paternity and patriarchy. Yeah, I think that's great. I'm not really against that. But at the same time, it must be balanced, right, with a look at what the female psyche is, because they're entwined, aren't they? They overlap. They cannot be thought of one without the other.
Oh, well, the whole idea of a female psyche would be an offense to the modern kind of sensibility of the social justice warrior. There can be no such thing as a female psyche. That's where I'm saying, I mean, the whole framing of the book is controversial in that sense. And yet, as the more you dig into it and expose it, and from a historical perspective, I think it just exposes the craziness of that argument. Of course there's a female psyche. Of course we've dealt with it through history, and there's been all this great thinking about it. Why would we possibly deny that?
Well, because we're living in a post-psychological, post-introspective world. And so the psyche plays no role. Psychology, right? The word psyche means soul. It's in psychiatry. It's in psychology. It's in psychoanalysis. Do you think any one of those three groups ever give a shit about the soul? No. They use the very word soul from the Latin psyche, and yet they're dealing with, I don't know what, the brain or behavior or whatever. The soul plays no role in anything today, let alone in the areas that you just mentioned, and rightly so. So I'm bringing my psychology is truly psychology. It is the psychology of the soul. And when a fetus, let's put it this way, when you're born and you're a girl and you're in the mother's womb, you better believe that her psychology is affecting you. And then it's affecting you on such an implicit level that as you move towards the masculine world, the solar world, this lunar consciousness is your basis, your roots. And it's not all positive. So the point, there are very great positives, and women groups have focused on the positive aspects of the maternal and the feminine psyche and the need to embody that again. But the trouble is with them is that they seem to be incapable of looking at also the negative sides of the female psyche. And believe me, both male psyche and female psyche have dark sides. And the dark side of the female psyche is a subject that is completely fallen off the shelf in all areas. Yeah, the books that focus on it, I mentioned on my website, there are that few that probably you'll only know about them by coming to my website, dragonmother.org, and checking it out. There are that few. And then, so yeah, there's definitely been an interest in it's actually, you wouldn't believe this, but the subject that's preoccupied me the longest has been the female psyche, right? It dates from the late 80s, actually, when I first get, intrigued with that. So all my other work that people are familiar with, all of it, is a footnote to this greater interest of mine, which is psychology in general and the female psyche particularly. So Dragon Mother is the product of researches that have been done since about 1988, 89, can you believe? And then it was put into the Dragon Mother this year. So this year, you can imagine, has been a very big milestone for me and a feeling of great achievement, by finally putting my ideas into the book and into the website. And we will be doing podcasts on it down the line. You asked what we'll be doing in the future. Certainly that one will be coming up in the next couple of weeks or months.
Well, I really look forward to that. I think you've tapped into something that is very, very deep and amazingly interesting on so many different levels. So the book, again, is Dragon Mother, and I do look forward to hearing more episodes of that on your excellent podcast, Unslaved. Do check out Michael's other work and kick in a few bucks to his film project, The Occult History of Ireland. I think it's going to be a worthwhile venture, and I'm kicking in a few bucks, so please join me in that. Michael, like I said, it's been great having you on, and I do hope we stay in touch and can reconnect on some other things that will be going on in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you, Alex, and keep up the great work, my friend.
Thanks again to Michael Tsarion for joining me today on Skeptiko. I guess the question I'd have to tee up from this interview, and I could pick many, and I hope you all will, some additional ones other than the race one, but that's the one I guess I have to lead with because that's what I led with at the beginning of the show. And the question would be around this topic of race and extended consciousness. I think it totally just doesn't make any sense when you look at race from an extended consciousness perspective, like we talked about, whether it's near-death experience or mediumship, past life, between lives, all that stuff. I think just makes it all look rather ridiculous. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the way we treat it is strange. I mean, why is it that some druid like Emma Restel Orr can talk about connection to blood and connection to land, and no one's calling her out on being racist? But that's exactly what it is. And then someone else talks about all the benefits that's been bestowed on them by virtue of the fact that they have this particular bloodline or genetic connection. And immediately, that's a hot button for people. And what about all the real scientific questions there? I mean, how does epigenetics really work? Does it follow a bloodline? Does it follow a genetic line? Or, as Rupert Sheldrake's research on morphic resonance points out, is it more of a group social phenomenon? So there's really a lot to deconstruct on this topic, and that's why I guess I'm so grateful that people like Michael Tsarion are willing to go there. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Skeptiko. I have more coming up. As I mentioned before, if you're interested in getting more involved in this community, do drop me an email. If you're interested in commenting on the show, just go on over to the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com, where you can download any of the previous shows for free or join us on the forum or comment on this show. As always, thanks for coming along on this Skeptiko ride. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, take care and bye for now. So thanks for watching this video. And if it wasn't really a video, but just an audio stored as a video, I apologize. But there's more videos out there as well. But please check out the Skeptiko website. You can see it here. We cover a lot of different stuff you might be interested in relating to controversial science and spirituality. A lot of shows up there, over 350 of them or so, all free, all available for download. So do check it out.